Chuck Norris stepped out of the cab and looked up at the familiar sign above the building, Haven. The name still gave him a quiet sense of pride. He had picked it himself, not just because it sounded comforting, but because that was what he wanted this place to be. A safe haven. A space where good food and good people met, where laughter was more than background noise. It had been months since he last walked through those doors, and though the facade looked the same, something in the air felt different. He didn't let the driver help with the bag. Just a simple backpack slung over his shoulder, nothing flashy, no entourage, no grand return. That wasn't his style. Tonight, Chuck wanted to be invisible. Just another man grabbing dinner at a place that meant more to him than most people would ever know. The street outside buzzed with the soft hum of evening energy. Cars rolled by, lights flickered in windows, and the faint sounds of silverware clinking inside Haven reached his ears. A normal night. But Chuck had learned over the years that normal could hide a lot of things. He took a breath, pulled his cap lower over his eyes and stepped inside. The scent of roasted garlic and thyme greeted him instantly. For a moment, it grounded him. This was the aroma he remembered, the one that used to make him smile from the kitchen doorway. The place was full, just like it should be. Waitstaff moved quickly between tables, dressed neatly in black and white, balancing trays and pouring wine. Chuck walked slowly, letting the mood of the place sink in. But there was something underneath the bustle, a stiffness in the shoulders of the servers, smiles that seemed just a touch too forced, eyes that flicked around the room like they were waiting for something to happen. He spotted a booth in the back, away from the lights. Perfect. He nodded to the hostess, who greeted him with a cheerful but mechanical welcome. No recognition. Good. She led him to the booth, handed him a menu, and disappeared before he could say much. Chuck opened the menu, but didn't read it. He just watched. From that quiet corner he could see most of the dining room. Couples talked quietly. A group of businessmen laughed too loudly. The music overhead was soft, tasteful, forgettable. He noticed small things. A busboy was walking faster than necessary. A waitress was blinking back, looking frustrated as a table complained. Nothing explosive, just off. Chuck had always trusted his gut, and tonight it was restless. His eyes drifted up to the far wall. And there it was. The old clock. An antique piece he had bought from a flea market in Austin. Wooden frame, Roman numerals, brass hands. A piece that never quite kept perfect time, but always ticked along reliably. It had hung there since day one. Now, it was wrong, off by almost 20 minutes. Most customers wouldn't notice. But Chuck did. That clock was a ritual for him. Every time he'd come in, he'd glance at it. Tonight, it was like seeing an old friend limping. He sipped the water the server had brought and leaned back. Something had changed. Chuck didn't panic. He didn't rush to conclusions. Years of martial arts, film sets, public appearances, and battles, real and metaphorical, had taught him one key lesson. Pay attention. Don't overreact. Listen first. He noticed the new manager before anyone pointed him out. A tall man, clean-shaven, well-dressed, moved through the restaurant like he owned the air. Logan. Chuck had seen his resume before, a hospitality pro, years at upscale chains, said all the right things during interviews. Chuck watched him now, and the feeling in his gut didn't get any better. Logan leaned in too close when he spoke to the staff. He smiled widely with guests, but turned cold when no one was looking. Chuck saw a young hostess nod stiffly after Logan whispered something to her. She smiled again, but it didn't touch her eyes. A waitress passed by Chuck's table, probably in her mid-20s, hair tied up neatly. She looked tired. Her name tag said Melody. She smiled as she poured his drink, but her hands shook just slightly, enough to make a drop of water slip down the glass. Chuck thanked her gently. Her shoulders eased for just a second. Then someone called her name from across the room. Logan's voice, sharp and clipped. She flinched, mumbled an apology, and hurried away. Chuck watched her go, then glanced around the room again. He wasn't looking for drama. He was looking for something that had gone missing. Soul, safety, dignity. He'd built Haven to be more than a business. It was supposed to feel like family. But now, it felt like performance under pressure. He sat back and let his memory drift. He remembered the early days, scraping together investors, trying out dishes late at night with the head chef, and standing outside in the rain on opening night just to greet the first guests in person. Those nights were hard, but full of life. This felt clinical, cold. Maybe it was just transition pains. Maybe Logan had a rougher style. But the clock still bothered him. That old clock had been set by Charlie. Chuck smiled softly at the thought of him. Charlie had been there from day one, 65 years old when he started bussing tables, just for something to do after retirement. Always humming a tune, always early, always noticed when things were off. Where was Charlie? Chuck hadn't seen him yet. Maybe he was off tonight. He scanned the room. Too many new faces. The turnover seemed high. He motioned for the bartender, a young man named Vic. When Vic came over, Chuck casually asked if Charlie still worked there. Vic blinked, then hesitated. "Oh, Charlie? Nah, he left a few weeks ago. Just didn't show up one day. Heard he moved out of town or something." Chuck nodded, said thanks, and let it go. But it didn't sit right. Charlie wouldn't just disappear, not without a goodbye. Chuck's mind moved slowly but steadily, like a river carving rock. He wasn't here to cause a scene, not yet. He needed to see more. He finished his water, folded his napkin, and stood up. Walking through the restaurant, he nodded politely to the staff. Some smiled nervously, some didn't meet his eye at all. He passed the side hallway that led to the restrooms and paused. That hallway used to be brighter. The light flickered once, buzzed faintly. Chuck turned and walked slowly down the corridor. No one followed. He stopped at the door to the men's room, then glanced to the side. The old employee lounge was now sealed, padlocked. Why would you padlock a break room? He stepped closer, noticing a faint noise from behind the door. Not movement, just the hum of electronics, a low, steady buzz. He turned back toward the hallway. A young server rushed by, nearly bumping into him. "Sorry, sir," she said quickly, not really looking. Chuck smiled faintly and let her pass. Then, something caught his eye. On the bench beside the restroom door was a tablet, still on, still open. He checked quickly. It was an internal staff app. The screen showed a name, Melody S. Score, 41 out of 100. Status, warning, behavioral metrics, shift engagement, positivity, responsiveness. Chuck stared. What was this? A system that graded humans like inventory? He didn't touch anything, just memorized what he saw. Then he heard it. A sharp voice from the dining room. "Melody, table 14 is still waiting." Chuck stepped back into the shadows. That voice was Logan. She responded with a "yes, sir," quietly, and rushed. Chuck walked slowly back to his table. He had seen enough for one night. The picture was forming. Not complete yet, but clear enough. Something was happening inside Haven. Something he hadn't approved, hadn't expected, and definitely hadn't imagined. And somehow, it all started with a broken clock. Tomorrow, he thought, he'd stay longer. Tonight, he would just listen a little more. Because leadership doesn't always mean taking charge. Sometimes it means knowing when to wait, When to watch? When can we really hear what people aren't saying out loud? Chuck looked around one last time before settling back into his booth. The clock on the wall ticked on, unaware of how wrong its time had become. Chuck arrived early the next evening, just before the dinner rush. He parked a few blocks away and walked the rest, wanting to clear his head. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. There was a quiet weight in the air, the kind that often shows up before something shifts. He wasn't here as the owner tonight, at least not officially. He was here as a man trying to understand what had gone wrong with something he loved. The night before had been revealing, but not enough. A crooked clock and a forgotten tablet had raised more questions than answers. Inside, Haven looked as polished as ever. Hosts greeted customers with trained smiles. The menu was crisp, the lights warm, the music soft. It was a carefully managed environment, but Chuck could sense the tension that pulsed just beneath the surface. He took a different table this time, one a little closer to the center, where he could observe more clearly, a spot where he could see both the dining floor and the path leading to the back of the house. Tonight, his server was a young man named Eli. Polite, well-groomed, but something in his eyes looked tired, not physically tired, worn out in a different way. Chuck ordered something simple, then he leaned back and started to watch again. It didn't take long before he noticed the small details adding up. The pacing. The clicked instructions from Logan to the staff seemed to move quickly but fairly, like people trying to stay out of trouble. A young waitress named Naomi walked past him carrying a tray of drinks. One glass wobbled dangerously near the edge. Just as she passed Logan, it slipped. The glass shattered on the floor, and everyone around froze for a split second. Chuck watched Logan step toward her, his tone calm but cold. He spoke low, too low for others to hear, but Chuck could see Naomi's face change. Her cheeks flushed with a mixture of fear and shame. She nodded quickly, bent down to clean up, and didn't look up again. Chuck clenched his jaw. That wasn't leadership. That was quite a humiliation, delivered like a whisper but with the force of a hammer. He'd seen that technique before. Strip someone's confidence in public, but do it softly enough that no one else can step in. It's control, not correction. Later, Chuck asked Ely, gently, if Naomi was okay. Ely hesitated, then nodded. Too fast. Said she just gets nervous under pressure. Chuck let it sit. No need to push yet. People only open up when they feel safe, and right now, no one here feels safe. As the night went on, he started to notice more missing faces. Servers and line cooks who'd been part of the Haven family for years were gone. Some of them had been the soul of the place, replaced by new hires who barely made eye contact. The kitchen, once lively with chatter and laughter, now worked in near silence. Chuck spotted an older man at the edge of the dining room wiping down a table. He recognized him faintly. One of the dishwashers, maybe. The man kept glancing toward Logan, even though Logan wasn't speaking to him. That kind of hyper-awareness only comes from fear. Chuck had felt it before. Years ago, on sets, in boardrooms, even in his own life, when he'd stayed too quiet for too long. After his meal, Chuck took a walk through the restaurant like any customer might. He stopped by the bar, ordered a decaf coffee and sat for a bit. That's when he saw the notice board behind the counter. It was filled with new charts and graphs, color-coded shift schedules, a column labeled engagement score, another labeled emotional load risk. It looked more like an HR dashboard from a tech startup than a family restaurant. He asked the bartender, a soft-spoken man named Derek, if those charts were new. Derek shrugged, looked down at the counter and said, "Yeah, all that came in about 2 months ago." Logan said he wanted more efficiency, said it was part of the new direction. Chuck nodded. The word efficiency always made him uneasy when it came to people. You can streamline processes, but the moment you try to streamline people, you lose something essential. As Chuck got up to leave, he passed near the hallway again. He noticed Melody standing there, talking quietly with another young woman. Their conversation paused when he passed, and Melody gave him a polite smile. Chuck hesitated, then spoke softly. "I told her she handled her shift well last night." Her smile twitched, real for a second, before it slipped back into that rehearsed calm. He paused again, then asked carefully if she had a minute. They stepped into a quieter corner, near the side exit. Melody looked nervous, glancing around like she expected someone to interrupt. Chuck lowered his voice and told her he used to know Charlie. Her face changed. She looked away, then back, as if weighing something. Finally, she said quietly that Charlie didn't leave because he wanted to. He was asked to resign. No write-up, no warning. Just a conversation in the back office that ended with his last paycheck. The reason, she said, was that he undermined the new system. Chuck asked what that meant, and Melody's voice broke slightly as she said he had questioned the scoring system. Said it felt wrong. Said people weren't machines. Chuck felt something twist in his chest. He asked what happened next. Melody said the next day he was gone. And a new rule was posted. No talking back, no questioning policy, and no breaks unless scheduled. Chuck asked what she thought of the system. Melody didn't answer at first. Then she said, it made her feel like she was constantly being watched, like she had to smile a certain way, speak a certain way, even breathe a certain way, like any slip might cost her a point, and too many lost points could mean losing everything. She said Logan called it accountability, but to her it felt like being punished for being human. Chuck thanked her, told her to take care of herself. Then he walked out the side door, into the night air. Outside, the sky had darkened and the street lights flickered on. The world looked the same, but Chuck felt heavier, not with confusion anymore, but with clarity. The restaurant he had built wasn't failing because of bad business. It was losing its soul because it had become too focused on control, on metrics, on artificial order. People weren't allowed to breathe, to connect, to be real. And the worst part was, no one felt like they could speak up. Chuck thought of the people watching this story unfold. People like him, maybe. People who'd spent decades building businesses, leading teams, and raising families. People who knew what it meant to have influence, and the quiet burden that comes with it. He knew they'd understand what he felt now, that influence isn't about rules or systems, it's about presence. About seeing the people in front of you, not just measuring them. The next step, he knew, wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. It was time to start asking harder questions. And more importantly, it was time to start listening deeper. Because when people stop talking, it's not peace. And it's fear. And silence like that can spread. But so can courage. And Chuck had always believed in starting where you stand. ChatGPT said. Chuck returned to Haven on a quiet weekday afternoon. It was the kind of time most people overlooked, between the late lunches and the early dinner crowd. That lull was exactly what he wanted. It gave him space to move, observe, and ask without drawing too much attention. He entered through the back this time, using the service door he still remembered from the early days. The hinges squeaked, just a little, like they always had. Familiar details mattered to Chuck. They anchored him. Lately, however, every time he found something familiar, it seemed to be attached to something unfamiliar just beneath the surface. He walked slowly down the narrow corridor that ran behind the kitchen. The walls were freshly painted, a little too clean, like someone was trying to cover something up. Even the light felt artificial, colder than it used to be. The kitchen itself hummed with quiet efficiency. No banter, no radio, just orders shouted, dishes clattering and shoes squeaking on tile. He passed one of the sous chefs, whom he didn't recognize. The man nodded briefly, but didn't stop. No eye contact, just movement. Chuck continued down the hallway toward the old break room. That space used to be warm, even messy. A couch with a tear in the arm, a coffee pot that never quite worked, a corkboard full of pictures, birthdays, and notes from staff. He had wanted it to feel like home. A small corner where people could breathe. Now the door was shut and locked. A new keypad blinked red beside the handle. Security in a break room? That didn't sit right. Chuck glanced around, no one nearby. He moved closer to the door and pressed his ear to the frame. He heard a low humming sound. Machinery, maybe, or electronics. Not voices, not laughter. That room was no longer what it used to be. As he stepped back, something caught his eye. A tablet was left on a stool just outside the kitchen office. Its screen was still on. That alone wasn't odd. But the app opened on the screen. It wasn't a menu or a scheduling tool. It looked like a dashboard. Names, scores, tags, the kind of system used to monitor behavior. Under Melody's name, Chuck saw a list of entries. One noted she had failed to smile during a guest interaction. Another labeled her as emotionally inconsistent. Each item deducted a small number of points. Chuck's stomach tightened. This wasn't just about performance, it was about control. Smiles weren't encouraged, they were required, and anything less was penalized. He scanned the list. A few other names he recognized had even lower scores. Notes next to them included things like tone, being too quiet, or not maintaining eye contact with the guest. It was subtle but dangerous, judging people based on coded impressions, turning human behavior into data to leverage. He didn't take the tablet, just took a mental snapshot. He'd seen enough systems like this in the business world to know where they led. The language was always clean, professional, but the impact was personal. It chipped away at confidence, decision-making, and even identity. People became cautious, hesitant, and afraid of being themselves. Chuck stepped away before anyone returned. He moved through the kitchen, pretending to check on the space, as any curious owner might. The staff kept their heads down. No one spoke unless spoken to. It was like watching a machine with moving parts, not people with presence. He asked a line cook where the manager's office was. The man pointed, but didn't make eye contact. Chuck thanked him, then headed in that direction. But he didn't knock. Not yet. Instead, he took the narrow stairwell beside the office that led to the small upstairs loft. It was barely used anymore, but it gave him a clear view of the restaurant floor and parts of the kitchen below. From up there, Chuck could see the pattern he had been sensing, the nervous glances, the forced cheer. He sat for a while, quiet, watching. That's when he heard voices from downstairs, near the break room, low, tense. He recognized Melody's voice. And someone else's. Another server, maybe. Chuck moved quietly, easing down the stairs and following the hallway to the far side of the building. The voices were clearer now. He stood just out of sight, letting the words find him. Melody was speaking fast, her voice tight. She said she couldn't take much more of it and that the system was getting worse. That someone named Ethan had just been fired for not logging enough guest delight moments in 1 week. She said she barely slept, always worried that she'd lose points in her next shift for something she didn't even notice. The other voice, a woman named Lena, tried to comfort her, but even her tone carried exhaustion. Then came a sentence that froze Chuck in place. Melody said she saw Logan adjust someone's score manually after they spoke up in a staff meeting. Not based on performance, just punishment. Quiet and clean. Chuck stepped back and leaned against the wall. His mind raced. This wasn't mismanagement. This was a system being weaponized. And worst of all, it was hidden in plain sight. That break room wasn't a break room anymore. It was a monitoring center, a control hub. Chuck had built Haven on trust and human connection. What it had become was something else. Something dressed in efficiency but driven by fear. He walked out of the hallway and back into the dining area. The afternoon crowd had begun to pick up. Customers chatted, smiled, and enjoyed their meals. They didn't see what was happening behind the walls. They weren't supposed to. Chuck sat at the bar again and nodded to Derek. He asked about Charlie. Derek paused, then looked around. His voice was quiet when he answered. He said Charlie had asked too many questions, wondered why people were being rotated off schedules without a reason, why long-time employees were being nudged out. He told Logan that he thought the staff deserved more say. The next week, he was gone. Official reason: performance mismatch. Chuck felt something sink inside him. Charlie wasn't just pushed out, he was erased. No farewell, no appreciation, just removed. That night, Chuck didn't sleep well. He sat in his small apartment, surrounded by old photos of the early days of Haven. Staff parties, training sessions, team meals after hours, faces full of life, faces that were now mostly gone. He stared at the picture of Charlie and him, arms around each other, both laughing at something no one remembered. That laughter was what made the place. Not just the food or the layout. It was the energy people brought. Chuck knew then that this wasn't just a management problem, it was a cultural infection. And infections, if ignored, don't just harm a few, they take down the whole system. The next day, Chuck returned with a plan. He wouldn't confront Logan, not yet. He needed more than emotion, he needed the undeniable truth. He called an old friend, someone he trusted in IT and workplace auditing. He asked for help gathering real data, not the kind Logan could doctor, the kind that told the real story. His friend agreed quietly, off the record. Chuck also began speaking to staff during breaks. Nothing heavy, just simple conversations. Asking how they were, what they missed about how things used to be. Little by little, the stories came out. Most weren't dramatic, but they carried weight. People said they felt invisible, like their value was only tied to a number. They said they used to feel like part of something, but now it felt transactional, empty. One busser said he missed the old team meetings where they could suggest ideas. Now, suggestions were considered resistance. Chuck thanked him and kept listening. By the end of the week, Chuck had a full picture. And something else, too. A recording. One of the servers had captured a meeting between Logan and the supervisors. Logan's voice was clear. He said the old culture was too soft, that loyalty didn't mean productivity, that if people weren't motivated by reward, they'd be motivated by fear. Chuck sat in silence as he played the recording back. He didn't feel angry. He felt responsible. This had happened under his name, under his roof. He hadn't seen it coming, but now he did. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It was time to act, but not with rage, with resolve, with clarity. Chuck understood now. True leadership wasn't about showing up when it was convenient. It was about showing up when it was hardest. And tomorrow, he would. Chuck showed up before sunrise. The streets were still damp from last night's rain. It was the kind of quiet that allowed you to hear your own thoughts. He didn't need to sneak in, but he chose the side entrance anyway. Old habits from years of being in the public eye. Sometimes the best way to lead is to walk in like no one's watching. The restaurant was still asleep. Chairs were stacked on tables. The smell of cleaning products lingered faintly in the air. He paused in the middle of the dining room, letting his eyes travel across the space. This used to feel alive, like the hum of a family waking up. Now it felt still. Too still. He walked toward the back, toward the service hallway, and stopped beside the storage room. He didn't have a key, but he didn't need one. The night before, one of the servers had slipped him a copy. Said it was the only way to prove what was really going on. Chuck turned the lock gently and stepped inside. The room had changed. What once held backup linens and dry goods now housed a small desk, 2 monitors, and a second tablet docked in a charger. On the wall was a whiteboard with dozens of names listed underneath categories he didn't recognize. Next to some names were stars. Next to others, red lines. He sat down and tapped the tablet. It opened without a password. The screen lit up with the employee dashboard. Each staff member had a file. Each file had metrics, tags, audio recordings, and behavior assessments. The system automatically tracked time spent in each area of the restaurant. It even monitored the tone of voice. Smiling wasn't just encouraged, it was logged. Chuck scrolled to Melody's name. Her last entry included a flagged note, hesitant when asked to work an extra shift. Score, adjusted by 4 points. Review, pending. He closed the tablet and stared ahead. This wasn't structured, this wasn't feedback, this was manipulation dressed as management. Charlie's name wasn't even in the system anymore, erased, like he never existed. Chuck took out his phone and quietly snapped a few pictures. Not just to keep a record, but to remind himself later how subtle control can be, how silence often wears a professional face. He left the storage room just as he heard footsteps approaching. It was Melody. She looked surprised to see him there so early. Her eyes flicked to the key in his hand. For a moment she looked afraid, but Chuck shook his head gently and told her she wasn't in trouble. He thanked her for trusting him. Said it wasn't over yet. They stepped into the walk-in cooler to speak privately. The hum of the compressor offered just enough noise to cover their words. Melody spoke quietly, her breath rising in puffs in the cold. She said Logan had changed the rules 2 months ago. No one could question the system. They weren't even supposed to talk about it. There were cameras now, even in the staff locker room. People whispered instead of speaking. Some cried in the bathroom but told no one. Chuck asked if she had ever seen anyone get their score changed manually. She nodded. A line cook named Marcus once spoke up in a pre-shift meeting, told Logan the system was unfair. The next day, Marcus's score dropped overnight. He was pulled off the schedule the same week, no explanation. Chuck asked where the data went, who else saw it. Melody hesitated, then said something he didn't expect. She had seen Logan send emails from a locked laptop to an address that didn't belong to the restaurant. She thought it was someone outside. Maybe an investor, maybe someone is helping run the program. Chuck's mind started piecing things together. This wasn't just one manager abusing power, this was something bigger, something structured. If Logan wasn't acting alone, then there was another layer to this. He needed to find out where the system came from, who built it, who benefited from it. But first, he needed to understand its full reach. Later that day, Chuck approached one of the newest servers, a quiet young man named James. He had been at Haven only 3 weeks. Still learning faces, still nervous. Chuck asked him, gently, how the training had been. James said it was mostly digital now, no human trainers, just an online module that walked through policies, behavior expectations, and the scoring system. Chuck asked if any part of it taught soft skills, like empathy, listening, or handling tough customers with grace. James shook his head. Said the training focused on posture, tone, timing, and speed. There was no mention of connection, just performance. That's when Chuck realized something crucial. The system wasn't just tracking people. It was teaching them to stop being human. It rewarded the illusion of perfection, not sincerity, not growth. He thanked James and walked out to the parking lot to clear his head. The sky had turned a soft grey, one of those overcast afternoons that made everything feel slower. Chuck leaned against the hood of his car, arms crossed, watching the world move by. He thought of all the people he'd worked with in his life, On film sets, at charity events and in businesses, the ones who truly made a difference weren't always the smartest or the fastest. They were the ones who knew how to listen, who made people feel seen. That's what Haven used to be. It was never about being flawless. It was about being real. Chuck looked down at the tablet in his hand, still holding the data he'd collected. And then he made a decision. He wasn't going to confront Logan with emotion. He was going to confront him with proof. He was going to let the story speak for itself. Chuck spent the evening organizing everything he had: screenshots of the employee scoring dashboard, photos of the whiteboard from the locked storage room, a copy of the training module that James had shared, and the most damning piece, an audio file. Melody had recorded a conversation between Logan and a shift lead, where Logan explicitly said the system was designed to weed out the ones who don't fall in line. It wasn't just a slip of the tongue, it was the strategy. The kind of language used in high-control environments, where compliance was more important than contribution. Chuck had heard that tone before in boardrooms where people talked about efficiency as if it were a religion. He didn't sleep much that night, not out of stress, but for no purpose. He knew that tomorrow, the real conversation would begin, and not just with Logan. It would start with one person, but it was about something bigger: culture, integrity, and whether leadership meant control or connection. The next morning, Chuck arrived as the staff gathered for their pre-shift huddle. It wasn't a formal meeting, just a few moments before opening when people were assigned tasks and given the day's priorities. Logan always led them, usually with a clipboard in hand and a tight-lipped smile. Chuck stood just outside the group and waited. When Logan saw him, he paused, looked surprised, then forced a grin. "Didn't expect you this early," he said. Chuck didn't respond right away. He looked at the staff, some familiar, some new, and gave a simple nod. Then he walked into the middle of the circle and asked everyone to pause what they were doing for just 5 minutes. There was silence. Logan tried to speak again, but Chuck raised a hand gently. "I won't take much of your time," he said. "I just want to ask you all something. Have you ever felt like you couldn't speak freely here?" The question hung in the air like a weight. Eyes darted around. No one spoke. Some looked at the floor. Others at Logan. Chuck continued. "Suppose you've ever felt like you had to smile when you didn't feel like smiling. If you've ever felt like your job depended on a score you didn't understand. Or if you've ever been afraid to make a mistake, even a small one, because you knew it would be held against you. I want you to know something. That's not leadership. That's fear." He looked directly at Logan, then back at the group. "And I didn't build this place to be run by fear." One of the servers, Lena, let out a quiet breath. Chuck pulled out his phone and played part of the recording. Logan's voice filled the room. "We don't need people who question the system. We need people who follow it. If they don't like it, they can leave. We'll find someone else." Chuck stopped the recording. That was recorded 3 days ago. Still, no one moved. He turned to Logan. "You said this was about efficiency, about results, but you built a system that punishes people for being human." Logan opened his mouth to defend himself, but Chuck didn't let him. "You erased people. You turned loyalty into a liability. And you did it all behind closed doors, under my name." Chuck handed the tablet to one of the shift leads. "These are the internal notes, the flags, the manual score changes, the hidden recordings." He turned to the group. "I want you all to look at this, not because I want to prove someone wrong, but because I want you to remember what this place was supposed to be. We're not machines, and Haven will never treat you like one again." There was a long silence, a real one, not the forced quiet of fear, but the stillness that comes when truth settles into a room. Then Melody stepped forward. She said, "Thank you." Just 2 words, but her voice shook. One by one, others followed. Not with speeches, just small acknowledgements, quiet agreement, glances that said, "Finally." Chuck looked at Logan. "You're done here," he said. Logan didn't fight. He looked at the group, then at the tablet, then back at Chuck. "Fine," he muttered. "You'll regret it." Chuck's expression didn't change. "No, I regret not coming back sooner." Logan left without another word. When the door closed behind him, it felt like a release. Chuck looked around the room. "I'm not here to micromanage you. I'm here to make sure this never happens again. We're going to rebuild the culture of Haven from the inside out. Starting today, real leadership doesn't hide behind dashboards. It walks into the room, looks people in the eye, and listens." Chuck asked if anyone had something to say. No feedback, just thoughts. James spoke first. He said he'd never felt safer. That started a ripple. By the end of that morning, Chuck had spoken with every staff member one-on-one, just 5 minutes each, not to correct, but to hear. And in every conversation, he asked the same final question. What would make you proud to work here? The answers surprised him. They weren't about pay or perks. They were about respect, about fairness, about knowing someone had their back when they spoke the truth. That afternoon, Chuck sat alone in the back booth. Same seat he had taken that first night. The clock on the wall still ticked softly, still a little slow. He decided not to fix it. Let it be a reminder. Some things are worth slowing down for. Because when people matter, time bends with purpose. And that's how real culture begins again. ChatGPT. That evening, the shift ended a little differently. No one rushed out the door. No one ducked their head and slipped away in silence. They lingered. Some cleaned slowly, others gathered near the coffee station in the back. A few laughed, soft, almost uncertain at first, but it was laughter nonetheless, the kind that hadn't been heard in Haven for months. Chuck stood near the pass window, watching. He wasn't ready to go home, not yet. Melody walked up with a cloth in her hand. Her shoulders looked lighter. She said something strange had happened at her table tonight. She felt more present, more honest. She said for the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid to just be herself. Chuck smiled, told her that mattered more than any score ever would. They stood in silence for a few seconds. Then she asked the question he'd been waiting for. "What's next?" Chuck took a breath. He said it wasn't about flipping everything upside down overnight. It was about reclaiming what had always been there, but had gotten buried. They would begin by removing the surveillance-based system entirely. No more scoring, no more silent punishments disguised as policy. He'd bring back team meetings, not lectures. Conversations. A space to listen and ask and grow. He'd also bring back the staff war. Pictures, names, birthdays. Little things that reminded people they were part of something shared. Melody asked if he thought people would trust again. Chuck answered honestly. He wasn't sure, but he was going to show up until they did. In the following days, Chuck kept his word. He brought back Charlie. The moment Charlie stepped through the front door, the staff burst into applause. Some didn't even know him, but they had heard the stories. The quiet respect for the man had outlived his presence. Chuck gave him a hug, then stepped aside and let Charlie take his old seat in the prep area, just like before. Quiet, observant, steady. Charlie didn't speak much, but his eyes said plenty, and when he finally did speak, it was to a young dishwasher who looked lost near the dish pit. Charlie showed him a better way to stack the trays, nothing forceful, just guidance, gentle but clear. That was what Haven had been missing. Not controlled, but care. Chuck also brought in a coach to work with staff on communication, not some polished trainer with slides and bullet points. A woman named Tersho had spent 20 years in hospitality and understood people. She spoke with warmth, asked simple questions like, "What do you need from your team when the kitchen is in chaos?" Or, "How do you want to feel at the end of a long shift?" She reminded them that communication isn't about saying more, it's about meaning what you say. People responded, slowly, then faster. Eyes lifted again, posture shifted, trust, like a plant, began to reroot. One afternoon, Chuck found a sticky note on his office door. It read, "Thank you for seeing us. Signed, all of us." He held it for a long time before putting it inside his wallet. Not because it was grand, but because it was real. And real had become rare. A few weeks later, Chuck sat with Charlie out by the back alley patio, drinking coffee. They didn't say much at first. They didn't need to. Finally, Chuck asked what Charlie had thought the moment he was let go. Charlie sipped his coffee, then said softly, "I thought I'd failed you, that I'd built something with you that didn't last." Chuck shook his head. "You didn't fail. We stopped paying attention, that's all." Charlie nodded slowly, then added, "But the thing about culture, it never dies. It just waits to be claimed again." That night, Chuck stood at the front of the house as the dinner crowd thinned out. He watched Melody laugh with a couple at table 7, watched Ely teaching a new server how to reset a wine glass quietly, watched Derek at the bar handing out lemonade to a kid who wasn't old enough for the cocktails yet. It was subtle, but Haven was coming back to life. Not through big speeches, not through flashy systems, but through presence, through conversation, through moments that reminded people they were more than a function on a schedule. They were people, and when people are seen, they give more than compliance. They give heart. Chuck knew this wasn't the end of the story. Not even close. There would be days when things slipped, mistakes, tension, frustration. But now, there was language for it, space for it. More importantly, people are willing to speak and listen. That was leadership. Not the kind built on command, but the kind built on connection. Chuck stepped outside into the cool air. The city hummed softly around him. He looked up at the sky, dark but clear, and thought about all the moments that had brought him here. The good, the hard, the silent ones that had gone unnoticed. He knew now that attention is the most generous form of leadership, and he intended to keep giving it. One conversation at a time. The next morning, Chuck came in early again. He made it a habit now, not because he needed to oversee operations, but because he wanted to greet the day before, which was filled with noise. That early hour, when the city was still stretching, gave him time to reconnect with the space, with the people, and most importantly, with himself. He walked through the dining room slowly, not checking, just noticing. The chairs were in place, the lights dimmed low in their morning calm. He stopped by the host stand, flipped open the reservation book, and then smiled. There were small notes left by the hosts, reminders about returning guests. One had scribbled, "Table 9, anniversary, bring candles." These were the details that mattered, the human touches. Later that morning, the team gathered in the prep kitchen before the first tickets came in, not for a meeting, just coffee, just people. Chuck leaned against the counter while Charlie brewed a fresh pot. Melody leaned nearby, arms crossed, her apron already tied, hair back. She looked more grounded than he'd ever seen her. She told him something he didn't expect. She said she'd started journaling after each shift, just a few lines about what she noticed, what she felt, and what went right. And for the first time in her life, she felt like her job was part of her personal growth. Chuck didn't say much. He just smiled and said he'd done the same thing for years. He hadn't shared that with many people. But during his film years, his early business deals, and even his hardest days, he wrote. Small pages, thoughts, not about tasks, about presence. He told Melody that awareness changes everything. Once you pay attention to what you're really feeling and what others might be feeling, you start to lead in a different way, not from control, but from alignment. Across the room, Derek was showing a new bartender how to fold a napkin around a glass without leaving a fingerprint. His voice was calm, encouraging, no scorecard, no metric, just care. Chuck nodded to himself. This was it. Not perfection, but presence. The team was growing stronger, not because they were pushed harder, but because they were seen and valued. And that made all the difference. That afternoon, Chuck met with Teresa, the communication coach. She had stayed on part-time to help the leadership team develop deeper trust and active listening skills, not just professionally, but personally. They sat in the back booth, the same one Chuck had used during his secret return. Teresa pulled out her notebook and asked, "What's changed?" Chuck answered honestly, "Everything, and yet, not much." He explained that systems could be dismantled, policies rewritten, but what had truly shifted was the emotional climate, and that had taken attention, time, presence, and a willingness to be vulnerable. He shared what he was learning most of all, that leadership is not about having all the answers. It's about holding the space where truth can emerge. Teresa nodded. Then she asked something deeper. "What did you learn about yourself in all of this?" Chuck leaned back. Let the question breathe. He said he'd always believed he was present, that showing up and doing the right thing was enough. But this experience had shown him that presence had layers. He had delegated culture, assuming it would maintain itself. He had trusted efficiency, thinking it wouldn't cross into coercion. And most of all, he had underestimated how quickly silence could become normal. What he learned was that even the strongest values can erode if not actively protected. That being present isn't just being physically there. It's choosing to be emotionally available, willing to ask questions, willing to hear answers that hurt. Teresa smiled. "That's the kind of presence people follow," she said. "Not out of fear, but out of respect." Chuck nodded. That evening, the restaurant was full. The room buzzed, not with pressure, but with energy. A subtle difference, but Chuck felt it deeply. Conversations were richer, the servers more confident, the guests seemed to stay longer, enjoying not just the meal, but the experience. And something beautiful happened. Guest at table 6 asked to speak to the manager, not to complain, but to compliment. She said her server, Lena, had made her feel like she was being welcomed into someone's home. Chuck watched Lena's face as she received the praise. It softened her, made her stand taller. She didn't beam with pride. She didn't giggle. She simply said, "Thank you," and meant it. That's what confidence built through connection looks like. Chuck stepped outside for some air. The night breeze was cool, clean. He stood still and let it move across his face. And as he looked up at the stars, he realized something else. This wasn't just about fixing a restaurant. It was about returning to a way of being, a way of leading, one that sees every person as a whole, not as a function, not as a metric, but as someone who matters. The kind of leadership that changes rooms, that shifts conversations, that restores culture, one honest moment at a time. He smiled quietly to himself. He was just getting started. Chuck stepped back inside. The warmth of Haven greeted him, not just from the lights or the gentle music playing over the speakers, but from the people. The kind of warmth you can't fake. It's the feeling that fills a room when people feel safe, when they trust each other, and when they're finally allowed to exhale. He made his way toward the kitchen, not to check or monitor, but simply to stand with the team. The line was busy, tickets clipped above the grill, sauté pans sizzling, plates being wiped clean at the pass. But even in the movement, There was ease. Charlie stood off to the side, watching the rhythm, his hands behind his back, his eyes scanning with quiet pride. Chuck moved next to him. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Charlie said something soft, almost to himself. "It feels like home again." Chuck nodded. He didn't need to add anything. Some truths are better left to settle on their own. After the dinner rush, the staff gathered in the kitchen for a brief closeout. It wasn't required. No one forced it. They stayed because they wanted to, because something meaningful had returned to their work. Belonging. Chuck leaned on the counter and told them what he'd been thinking. He said most people think culture is built through systems, through structure, through written values on a wall, and sure, all that can help. But the heart of any strong culture comes from the conversations we choose to have or avoid. He told them a story about one of his first movie sets, when a new assistant director tried to run the crew like a military operation. Everything was on schedule, but no one was speaking. The silence said everything. They were afraid. One night, an older lighting technician sat beside Chuck and said, "Efficiency without empathy is just silent failure." That stuck with him. And it had taken all these years, and the near loss of Haven, for him to fully understand what it meant. He looked at the team now. You are not measured by your smile. You are not machines. You are human. And when you show up with presence, with care, with courage, you help build something no system can replicate. A few nodded. A few looked down, thoughtful. One or two smiled, in a way that wasn't forced. It was real. Over the following weeks, changes continued. Not loud or flashy, but steady. New policies were introduced and written by the team, not for them. An anonymous feedback box was added, not because they expected complaints, but because Chuck wanted to keep listening. The scoring system? Gone. Deleted from every device. In its place, a simple weekly check-in form, handwritten, that asked 3 questions. How are you feeling this week? What's one thing that went well? What's one thing we can improve? Chuck read every one, personally. He didn't delegate that, because connection could never be outsourced. And with each shift, the environment grew lighter. People spoke more freely, laughed again, supported one another, not in a scripted way, but in the natural way people do when they trust they won't be punished for being human. And one night, something small but powerful happened. A new hire, Mia, dropped a tray in the middle of the dining room. It clattered loudly, glass broke, guests turned. Everyone froze for half a second. Chuck stood from his booth and walked over. He knelt beside her and helped her pick up the pieces. She was flushed, nervous, and apologizing over and over. He said, "It's okay. It happens. You're safe." She looked up, surprised, then exhaled. That moment mattered more than any training session could, because leadership happens in the in-between, in the quiet choices we make when no one's expecting anything grand. It's not in the way we handle success, it's in how we handle someone's mistake, with dignity or with distance. Later that night, Mia left a note in the staff journal near the break area. She wrote, "I was ready to quit after today, but now I'm staying." Chuck saw the note the next morning. He didn't say anything. He just folded the page, slid it into his pocket, and smiled. This was the kind of leadership that would outlast him. Not based on fame or force, but on presence, humility, and the kind of respect that says, "I see you, you matter, let's grow together." He looked around the restaurant, now fully awake, with staff prepping for lunch. The clock on the wall still ticked, still a little off, and he left it that way, because some of the things that breathe and live and change us are worth showing up for early, and worth showing up every day, with heart, with awareness, and with the quiet courage to listen. Chuck stepped outside and took a long, slow breath. The midday air was warm, touched by the scent of rosemary and bread from a nearby bakery. He stood still on the sidewalk for a moment, watching people pass by. Strangers with errands, workers are on break, parents holding small hands. Life moved around him at its usual pace. But inside, something felt different. It wasn't just that Haven had changed, he had changed too. For years, Chuck believed leadership was about being decisive, strong, and the one who solved the problem first. And while that had served him in many seasons of life, it had also kept him at a distance from people, from emotion, from subtle signals that often spoke louder than words. He remembered a quote a mentor once told him, "Influence isn't about getting people to follow you. It's about becoming someone worth following." He thought about Melody, about Derek, about Charlie, and even about Mia, who stayed because someone gave her space to stumble. They weren't following him because he was Chuck Norris. They followed because he saw them. And in turn, they saw themselves more clearly. Back inside, Charlie was organizing dry goods in the storage area, a small task but one he took seriously. Chuck walked in and leaned on the doorframe, watching the rhythm of his movements. Charlie looked up and smiled. He asked if Chuck remembered that first week they opened. When the stove broke on a Friday night, they had to cook the entire menu using 2 induction burners and a single oven. Chuck laughed. Of course he remembered. But it wasn't the broken stove that stood out. It was how the team pulled together, unshaken. Not because someone barked orders, but because everyone felt they mattered enough to step up. Charlie nodded slowly. Then he said something Chuck hadn't expected. He said he was proud of Chuck, not for the fame, not for the business, but for choosing to come back when it would have been easier to stay away. That stayed with Chuck the rest of the day. Because presence, real presence, requires more than just showing up physically. It means being willing to witness the uncomfortable, to sit with what you missed, and to take responsibility without losing compassion for yourself. Chuck didn't do it perfectly. He had missed things, trusted too blindly, assumed too much. But now he was paying attention. And paying attention, he had learned, is one of the purest forms of respect you can give another human being. Later that evening, Haven held its first staff story night. No microphone, no stage. Just a circle of chairs in the dining room after the guests had left. Teresa suggested it, a space where anyone could share a moment from their life, not related to work, just something that shaped them, a memory, a lesson, a regret. Melody was the first to go. She shared a story about her father, a quiet man who rarely spoke, but once left her a note during a hard time. It simply said, "Even on days you can't hear your voice, I still believe in it." She carried that note in her wallet every day. Derek followed with a story about his mother, who taught him how to hold space for others by never interrupting someone when they were angry. He said he learned that sometimes silence is a gift, not a punishment. Others spoke too. James, Lena, even Mia. And when it came time for Chuck, he hesitated. But then he shared something he hadn't told the staff before. He said that years ago, in a moment of success, most people would celebrate but felt completely hollow. He was surrounded by applause, but all he wanted was for someone to ask how he was doing, without expecting a smile in return. That moment taught him that connection matters more than recognition, and it changed how he showed up in every room since. There was no applause that night, just presence, stillness, trust, and somehow that was louder than any cheer could ever be. When the staff began to trickle out, one by one, Chuck stayed behind to stack chairs. Melody came up beside him and handed him the note from her father. She said she made a copy for him. He looked at it, then at her. She said, "Just in case you ever have a day when you can't hear your own voice." Chuck smiled, took the paper and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Not because he needed to be reminded of who he was, but because he never wanted to forget what it meant to listen first. The restaurant was quiet again, but not the old kind of quiet. This one had depth. It had space. It had promise. Chuck turned out the last light and locked the front door. And as he walked to his car, the city lights blinking around him, he knew that he hadn't just saved Haven. He had remembered something far more important. Real leadership isn't about commanding a room. It's about creating a room where people no longer feel small. In doing that, you don't just change the workplace, you change lives. One moment, one word, one honest presence at a time. ChatGPT said. A week passed, then another, and slowly Haven wasn't just recovering, it was evolving. Chuck walked in one morning to find a new hand-drawn sign taped to the staff bulletin board. It read, "The heart of this place beats in every voice that's heard." No one signed it, but that didn't matter. He recognized the handwriting. It was Mia's. He didn't take the sign down, he framed it. It hung near the time clock, where every staff member would see it at the start and end of their day. Because that message was no longer just inspiration. It was true. Chuck began to notice how the smallest interactions shaped the mood of the whole team. A joke shared between line cooks before service, a note left in the server binder, "You got this today." A new bartender offered to cover someone's shift because he could tell they were overwhelmed. None of these things came from a manual. They came from a culture, a living one, a human one. And the more Chuck paid attention, the more he realized something powerful. The real currency of leadership was emotional safety. It wasn't about charisma or authority. It was about how people felt when they failed, when they made mistakes, when they said something awkward. Did they feel safe to try again? Or did they shrink? The difference between a thriving team and a surviving one often came down to that single question. He wrote that in his journal one night after a long day. "I can't make everyone perfect, but I can make them feel safe." That shift changed how Chuck handled everything. When a server messed up a large order, Chuck didn't correct them immediately. He asked, "What do you think went wrong?" and waited. Genuinely waited. The server admitted she had rushed the order, trying to impress a difficult table. Chuck nodded, then said, "That's honest. Thank you for owning it." That simple exchange did more for her confidence than any policy ever could. And it spread. Soon, employees began doing the same for each other. Instead of blame, there was curiosity. Instead of panic, there was reflection. And in that space, growth took root. Teresa, the coach, called it emotional leadership, but Chuck just thought of it as being real. He didn't need to play a role anymore. He didn't need to perform presence. He simply needed to show up with care. One day he noticed James speaking with a guest at the front. The guest had been difficult, demanding, and impatient. But James stood calmly, explained the situation, and asked how he could make things right. When the guest walked away, satisfied, Chuck pulled James aside. He asked, "What helped you stay grounded just now?" James smiled. "I remembered something you said. That if I listen for the fear behind the anger, I'll respond differently." Chuck hadn't even remembered saying it, but James had held on to it. That's what presence does. It leaves traces you don't even know are there. It shapes rooms long after the conversation ends. And it's in those moments, quiet, uncelebrated, real, that a leader sees what truly matters. Chuck started writing more frequently again, every morning, just a few lines, not about fixing things, just about noticing. Here's one entry. Today, the light hit the prep table at 8:12. Charlie's hands looked steady. Melody hummed while rolling silverware. No one asked for anything, but everything felt full. Another day, he wrote. Leadership isn't about stepping forward, it's about stepping aside, making space for others to rise. He didn't write these things to be wise. He wrote them to remember, because this new season at Haven wasn't a recovery. It was a rebirth. And the person changing most was him. He no longer saw mistakes as threats. He saw them as invitations to slow down, to listen deeper, to lead more gently. One night, as the last guests left and the staff swept the floor, Chuck stayed behind with Charlie. They locked up together, as they had done years before. Charlie looked at him and said, "You didn't rebuild this place, Chuck. You rewrote it." Chuck smiled. "No, we rewrote it. One quiet page at a time." He paused at the front door, keys in hand, lights off behind him. Then he looked back one more time, but just to take it in. The empty tables, the framed sign, the quiet, the presence. He didn't feel like a boss anymore. He felt like a caretaker. And of people, of space, of something that mattered far beyond food or profit or even reputation. He closed the door gently, then walked into the night, feeling more full than he had in years. And he knew the story of Haven was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever dared to speak up, everyone who stayed through the hard seasons, everyone who believed, even quietly, that things could be better. It was a story still being written. And Chuck, now more than ever, was ready to keep turning the page. With presence, with courage, and with the kind of leadership the world could always use more of. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived. Not an email, not a message, an actual envelope, handwritten, no return address. Chuck opened it slowly at the host stand before lunch service. The paper was thick. Careful cursive filled the page. It was from a former employee, someone Chuck barely remembered. They had worked at Haven for only a few months, a year before Logan's time. The letter was simple, but what it said brought Chuck to stillness. They wrote that back then, Haven had been the first place they felt like they mattered. They said the kindness of one evening shift, just one, where Charlie had stayed late to help them finish side work, had stayed with them during their darkest moments. They'd recently driven past Haven, unsure why, and something pulled them to park across the street and watch. They didn't go in, but they saw the lights, the movement, the team inside. They wrote, "It still feels alive, and somehow so do I. Thank you for building that, and thank you for protecting it." Chuck folded the letter carefully. He didn't read it again. He didn't need to, because it reminded him of why he started all this. And why, even now, when the pace slowed and the memory of crisis faded, the work was still sacred. That night, Chuck stood quietly by the bar and watched. No drama, no twist, just real life unfolding in a space filled with quiet confidence. Mia was training a new hire, someone shy, barely 19. She was patient, smiling in that calm way that only someone who had been given grace could pass on. James led a quick staff huddle before dinner. He spoke about teamwork, but more than that, about tone. How the energy they brought to one another before a single guest sat down would shape the rest of the night. Even Melody, once unsure whether she'd last another week, now stood as shift lead, directing with ease, correcting with kindness. Chuck didn't interrupt. He simply stayed near. His presence no longer carried tension or command. It carried trust. And that, he had learned, was the most powerful influence of all. The restaurant had become a mirror not just of the people in it, but of the values that guided it. Where fear had once lurked behind every clipboard, now clarity stood in its place. Not every day was smooth. There were still late deliveries, tough guests, frustrated moments, but the response was different. No panic, no blame. Just breathe. Regroup. Move forward. One afternoon, during a lull between lunch and dinner, Chuck stood outside on the back loading dock with Charlie. They leaned against the wall, sipping iced coffee, watching the clouds roll across the sky. Charlie said something Chuck never forgot. You know, this place, it's not just a restaurant. It's a kind of proof. Proof that people can change when they feel safe. Those places can heal, that leadership can be unlearned and relearned. Chuck nodded, then said quietly, maybe that's the point of building anything. To remind people what's possible. Charlie smiled. You didn't just remind them, Chuck. You remembered it too. A breeze moved past them, soft but cool, almost like a nod from the sky. Chuck let the silence settle. It wasn't awkward. It was full, because now there was space for quiet. And that meant everything. That evening, as the sun dipped low and golden light flooded through the front windows, Chuck stood once more in the dining room. The tables filled slowly. Families, couples, old friends, regulars, first-timers. The hum of conversation rose. The music played softly. Forks clinked. Laughter passed through the air like wind through trees. It wasn't dramatic, but it was beautiful. He glanced at the wall near the clock. The framed message still hung there. The heart of this place beats in every voice that's heard. Chuck smiled, eyes soft, then walked to the back. He didn't need to watch anymore. The place was in good hands. It was alive, not because of systems or policies, but because of people. Because they had been seen. Because someone had listened. Because presence had returned. He picked up his journal that night and wrote only one line. Leadership begins again every single day. And then, as the lights dimmed and the last dish clinked into the washer, Chuck Norris walked out into the evening, not as the man who saved a restaurant, but as the man who remembered what it means to lead from the heart. Chuck didn't drive home right away that night. Instead, he walked. The streets were quiet, the air mild, the kind that settles on your skin gently. There was no rush in his steps, no phone in his hand, no agenda in his mind, just a man walking in a city he'd known for decades, carrying a full heart and a quiet mind. He passed shops he used to visit, parks where he'd taken meetings just to get fresh air, even a bench where he once sat with his late friend and mentor, who told him something that echoed now more than ever. You're not here to impress people, you're here to care for them. At the time, Chuck hadn't fully understood. Now he did. Back then, he thought leadership was built in moments of decision. Now, he knew it was built in moments of attention, noticing the sigh behind someone's yes, recognizing when silence wasn't calm, but suppression, hearing what wasn't said, and being willing to ask gently anyway. He reached a small coffee shop that had already closed. The lights were off, but the smell of roasted beans still clung to the doorway. He paused there, hands in his pockets, and thought about everything the past months had revealed. Not just about Haven, about himself. How many years had he filled rooms, solved problems, led missions, and yet remained slightly apart? He was respected, admired, but how often had he let himself be known? And how many people under his leadership had needed just one more moment of real presence before they quietly gave up? These questions didn't haunt him. They grounded him, because now he had new tools, not just discipline or experience, but compassion, listening, emotional fluency. He smiled softly. A quiet realization rose inside. This chapter of life wasn't about proving he still had strength, it was about proving he still had room to grow. He turned and walked home. The next morning, he arrived early at Haven as usual. The street still carried the hush of dawn. Inside, the staff trickled in, some yawning, some smiling, all of them aware now that they mattered. He didn't need to run meetings anymore. They ran them themselves. He didn't need to correct. They asked for feedback before he offered it. What he did now was model just by being. Steady, present, available. He had become the kind of leader who didn't draw attention but invited it, who didn't take control but made space for others to rise. Melody came in carrying 2 coffees. She handed him one. She said, "It's been almost 2 months since that night, you know." Chuck nodded. She added, "I've never felt more sure of who I am at work than I do now." Chuck took a sip, smiled, said nothing. That was the moment. No applause, no speeches, just impact, the kind that lasts. Later that day, Chuck wrote a letter. Not for anyone specific, he just wanted to get something on paper. It began like this: to anyone who leads a team, a family, a business, or even just yourself. Remember this. People don't need perfect answers, they need honest attention. They don't follow strength, they follow sincerity. And if you want to leave something behind, make it a place where people feel safe enough to be seen. Because that changes everything. He folded the letter and placed it in the drawer where they kept blank menus. Maybe one day someone would find it. Or maybe not. Either way, it was there. Just like him. Not watching. Not controlling. Just listening. And that, as he now understood better than ever, was more than enough. Because true presence doesn't ask to be noticed. It simply remains. In the way people breathe easier when you enter the room. In the way they speak more freely when they know they'll be heard. In the way a place once broken can become whole again, not through pressure, but through care. That's what Haven had become, and that's who Chuck had become with it. Not just the owner, not just the name, but the keeper of its heart. And as long as that heart kept beating, in every voice, in every act of courage, in every choice to connect, he would keep showing up, one quiet day at a time. Weeks passed, then months. Haven wasn't just back. It was better. But not in the flashy ways most businesses brag about. There were no glossy magazine spreads, no viral videos, just quiet consistency. Warm light at the windows every evening, familiar faces behind the bar, conversations that flowed without fear, trust, not as a buzzword, but as a way of life. Chuck came in most mornings not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He'd help prep if someone called out sick. He'd chat with delivery drivers. Sometimes he'd just sit near the kitchen with a notebook, listening to the hum of life unfolding around him. The place no longer ran on urgency, it ran on care. It was subtle but powerful. You could feel it in how people treated each other during a rush, how they handled mistakes, how they looked after one another without being asked. One night, after closing, the team gathered for a simple celebration. No big milestone, just a moment to be together. They cooked for themselves and brought in dishes from home. Someone put on music. Laughter bounced off the walls. Charlie stood and raised his glass. He said, "I've worked in a lot of kitchens. Some were fast, some were loud, some were cruel, but this one has..." Everyone clapped, not wildly, just warmly, like they all knew exactly what he meant. Chuck looked around the table and saw something he hadn't seen in years. People who weren't just doing a job. They were sharing a purpose. Later that night, Melody pulled Chuck aside. She had something in her hand. It was a small, square card, simple, handwritten. It read, "Haven Team Values, written by us." She said the team had started jotting them down one by one after shift meetings. Nothing official, just truths that kept coming up. Chuck read them slowly. "We speak honestly. even when it's hard. We listen with the intent to understand, not reply. We celebrate progress, not perfection. We own our mistakes and help others recover from theirs. We protect each other's dignity, especially when no one's looking. He looked at her, no words for a second, then simply said, "This is it." She nodded, not proud, just steady. "This is who we are now." Chuck placed the card in the front binder, the one they gave to new hires. It wasn't framed, not laminated, just true. And sometimes the truest things don't need embellishment. In the weeks that followed, Haven welcomed new faces. Young people are looking for their first job, retirees want a second chapter, immigrants rebuilding, parents re-entering the workforce. Each time, Chuck made it a point to sit with them on their first day, not to explain the rules, to explain what kind of place this was. He'd say, "We're not perfect, you don't have to be either, but we protect this space fiercely, because people feel different when they feel seen, and we won't let that disappear again." Some would tear up, others would nod, not quite sure what to say. But it landed, because truth always does, when spoken gently. One rainy afternoon, Chuck walked through the dining room, now empty between shifts. He paused by the window and watched the water streak down the glass. The world moved fast out there, but in here, there was room to breathe. He pulled out his notebook, and on a new page wrote, "The greatest impact a leader leaves is not in systems or results. It's in how people feel about themselves when they're in your presence. If they feel small, they will shrink. If they feel seen, they will rise." That night, as he turned out the lights and stepped outside, Chuck took one last glance back through the window. He saw the reflection of a place rebuilt, not with pressure, but with presence. And he knew something with quiet certainty. This was a legacy, not the kind carved in stone or spylight, but the kind passed hand to hand, voice to voice, the kind that lives in someone's courage years from now, when they choose to speak, to stay, to lead differently, because one person once made space for them to be whole. Chuck smiled to himself and walked into the soft rain, not alone, not ahead, but right where he was supposed to be, leading, still, listening, always present, until the very end. The rain fell steadily as Chuck walked toward his truck, droplets rolling off his jacket, the soft patter on the sidewalk echoing like applause from the sky. He didn't rush. He let it soak into his shoulders, into his thoughts. Some people avoided weather like this. Chuck welcomed it. There was something about the rain that cleared the air, that humbled everything it touched. No titles, no roles, just man and moment. He reached the driver's side door and paused. Across the street, the restaurant glowed gently from within. The warm amber light spilled from the windows, and the faint silhouettes of staff wiping down counters and resetting tables were visible, preparing, as always, for another day. He thought about how far they'd come. Not in numbers, in trust. And trust, Chuck had learned, was never built in speeches or systems. It was built in the way you showed up after someone made a mistake. How did you respond when someone admitted they were scared? In what you chose to do the moment no one was watching. It was quiet work, invisible most days. But it was what made everything else possible. He opened the door, climbed in and sat behind the wheel for a moment with the engine off. A memory came to him, not recent, a long time ago. He was on a film set in the middle of nowhere, dust everywhere, exhaustion on every face. The crew had just finished a brutal scene, hours behind schedule, and everyone was tense. A young production assistant, barely 20, brought Chuck a bottle of water. She looked at him, anxious, and said, "Is there anything else you need?" He could have said no, could have nodded and moved on, but instead he asked, "How are you doing?" She blinked, stammered, said, "I'm okay." He asked again, and she burst into tears. She was on her third job that week, no sleep, afraid of messing up, feeling invisible. Chuck remembered sitting with her for 10 minutes, just listening. No advice, just presence. That night, she wrote him a thank you note. He kept it for years. What had that cost him? 10 minutes? What had it given her? A reason to stay. That was the power most people forget they have, especially leaders. Chuck turned the key in the ignition, headlights cutting through the mist. As he pulled away, he didn't feel like a man leaving something behind. He felt like someone who had finally come home. Not to a building, to a way of being. The next day, he arrived at Haven just after sunrise. Inside, a small envelope sat on the host stand with his name on it. He opened it slowly. Inside was a short note. "You don't have to say it out loud, but I hope you know, we feel it, and we're learning to give it too. Presence. Because of you. The team." Chuck held the note for a long time, then tucked it into his notebook, right beside the others. The collection now formed a small story in itself. A story not of fixing a place, but of remembering what people need most. Not approved, not perfection, but presence. And with that, he walked into the kitchen. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Again, as always, with heart. ChatGPT said. That morning moved slowly, the way mornings should. Sunlight slid in through the back kitchen window, catching the dust motes dancing over the prep table. The smell of fresh bread rising in the oven filled the room. Chuck stood near the sink, sipping his coffee, watching as Melody coached a new hire through folding napkins. She didn't bark instructions. She asked questions. She invited curiosity. Chuck smiled. That hadn't been in a manual. That came from culture, and culture, he knew now, was nothing more than behavior repeated with care. Later that day, Charlie passed by Chuck with a clipboard full of invoices. He paused, tapped the paper and said with a quiet grin, "We're not just profitable again, we're healthy. Every number reflects the energy in the room." Chuck didn't respond with a cheer. He just nodded slowly. Real leaders don't celebrate numbers. They celebrate what makes the numbers possible. He walked the floor at lunch, chatting with guests. Most didn't know who he was. He liked it that way. He stopped by one table where an older man sat alone, reading a paperback. Chuck asked how his meal was. The man looked up, smiled and said, "Honestly, I come here more for the peace than the pasta." That stuck with Chuck the rest of the day. More for the peace than the pasta. He repeated it under his breath later that night, sitting in his office, and the restaurant was quiet again. He wrote it at the top of a fresh journal page, then stared at it for a long time, because that sentence captured what mattered now. It wasn't about food, it was about feeling, about how a space could make someone feel respected, valued, and safe, about how leadership at its core wasn't about being followed. It was about creating space where people could come home to themselves. That realization stayed with him through the weeks that followed. He found himself slowing down even more, not because he was older, because he was wiser. He saw more by rushing less. He understood more by speaking less. And he was influenced by needing less credit. There were still challenges. A supplier fell through, a staff member had a family crisis, a customer wrote a nasty review, but nothing rattled the core, because the core was now strong, built not on personality or performance, but on presence. One afternoon, a friend stopped by, an old colleague from Chuck's filming days. They hadn't seen each other in years. They sat at the bar after hours, catching up over soup and quiet music. The friend looked around and said, "This place is different. It's got—" Chuck smiled. That word again. His friend leaned in, lowering his voice. "So tell me, what changed it?" Chuck looked down at his cup, thoughtful. "Then I stopped trying to fix people. I started showing up for them." His friend nodded slowly. "That's leadership," he said. "No cape, no title, just presence." Chuck didn't need to hear more. He already knew. The next morning, as he unlocked the front door before opening it, he paused for a moment. He took a breath and whispered to himself, "Just be here." Because that was the work now. That was the legacy. Not just a business that bounced back. Not just a team that grew stronger. But a space in a noisy world where people could breathe again. And where the leader wasn't the loudest voice, but the deepest listener. And that made all the difference. ChatGPT said. A few days later, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in the mail, not an email, not a typed message, a real letter, handwritten, the kind people rarely send anymore. It came from Hannah. Not a resignation, not a complaint, just her words, carefully penned. Chuck sat alone in the quiet office and opened it slowly. It began simply. "Mr. Norris, I wanted to thank you, not just for what you did that night, but for what you kept doing after. When I was at my lowest, you didn't try to rescue me. You simply stood still and saw me. You gave me dignity back. That moment changed me." Chuck felt a weight settle in his chest. Not a burden. Something heavier than pride, lighter than sorrow. The letter continued. "I used to think strength meant never showing fear. Now I think strength is giving someone else room to be afraid and still standing beside them. I'm starting school again, social work. I want to be that person for someone else one day." She signed it simply, but with gratitude and courage. Hannah. Chuck folded the letter slowly. He set it on the desk. Then I leaned back and let silence do what it does best. Carry meaning beyond words. That evening, when the team gathered after closing, he told them about the letter. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't need to. He just said, "Hannah's story didn't end here." And that's the point. What we build here follows people long after they leave. Melody nodded. Charlie looked down at the floor, thinking. Someone whispered, "She's going to do good things." Chuck replied, "She already has." The next day, they framed an empty page from the host's stand notebook. Right under it, they wrote, "Where stories begin." Guests started noticing. Some asked what it meant. Staff would smile and say, "Every name matters, every shift counts, every moment might stay with someone longer than you realize." And that became the new rhythm of Haven. Not fast, not flashy, but faithful. Faithful to each other. Faithful to the idea that presence is power and quiet leadership still shapes loud legacies. Years passed. Chuck grew older. He started showing up a little later, staying a little less, but the essence of who he was, what he stood for, remained in the air like the scent of fresh bread, always warm, always there. One day, when he stepped away fully and handed off the keys to Melody, no big announcement was made. Instead, she walked him to the door, pressed the keys into her own palm and said quietly, "You taught us how to lead without fear." Chuck turned to her and replied, "No, you taught yourselves. I just gave it time." Then he stepped out into the sunlight. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't carrying a plan or a problem, just peace. And perhaps that, more than any title or trophy, was the real reward. Not what he'd built, but what he'd made possible. A haven. And in the hearts of everyone who'd ever walked through those doors, it still lived. Because stories like that don't end. They echo. ChatGPT said. Years later, Haven still stood quietly on that same corner. The building aged gracefully, like a person who had lived fully and without regret. The paint faded just enough to feel lived in, but the windows were always clean. The front door opened with the same familiar creak. The sign out front still simply read, Haven. No tagline, no slogan. It didn't need one anymore. Inside, the faces had changed. New staff, new energy. But the heartbeat? That stayed the same. Melody now ran the place, with a kind of calm strength that didn't need to prove anything. People didn't work for her, they worked with her. She remembered the early years, the hard reset, the lessons carved into every quiet corner. She carried those memories like anchors in her chest. One afternoon, she gathered the team for a short meeting. The younger hires leaned against counters, sipping coffee, still shaking off the lunch rush. A few older ones sat at the bar, arms crossed, attentive. Melody stood near the center, holding a small, worn notebook. The same one Chuck used to carry. She said, "Let me tell you a quick story." Everyone leaned in. She told them about the night Chuck first walked through those doors, without telling anyone who he was. At that moment, he heard Hannah crying about how, in one single evening, everything changed. Not through a grand gesture, but through quiet, unwavering action. She didn't tell them to impress them. She told them to remind them. No matter where they came from, how old they were, or how new they felt, everyone had the same responsibility now. Not just to serve food, not just to smile, but to see people, to listen, to protect what made Haven different. When she finished, the room was quiet for a beat. Then someone asked softly, "What happened to Chuck?" Melody smiled. "He's doing just fine. He's somewhere by a lake these days, feeding birds and watching sunsets. Still listening, probably. Still leading, even if no one sees it." The room let out a low chuckle, the kind that meant understanding more than amusement. Melody placed the notebook on the shelf behind the host's stand, and, like every day, they opened the doors to the next wave of people walking in. Some came in for coffee. Some came in to celebrate a birthday. Some just needed to be somewhere that didn't demand too much. And every one of them walked into a space where the unspoken rule was simple. Here, you matter. One afternoon, much later, Chuck did come back. Unannounced. As always. The place was busy. No one recognized him at first. He sat near the window, ordered the soup, and watched. He saw a young hostess comfort a nervous new hire. Saw a server bend down to tie the shoelace of a toddler. Saw a manager take a deep breath before calmly resolving a difficult moment at a table. He didn't say much. Didn't need to. When Melody spotted him, she smiled without a word, came over and simply placed a cup of tea beside him. He looked up, said quietly, "You did it." She nodded. No pride in her eyes, just presence. And in that small moment, everything came full circle. Because some legacies aren't loud. They don't end with a standing ovation or a ceremony. They live in the quiet decision to lead with care, to protect dignity, to listen deeply, and to keep showing up, even when no one's watching. Especially then. Chuck stayed until closing that night. He didn't plan to, but something about the way the light fell across the wood floors, the way the hum of conversation softened after the dinner rush, made it hard to leave. He sat by the window, watching as tables emptied and the staff moved with a rhythm that felt less like work and more like music. When the last guests left, Melody joined him at the table. She brought 2 cups of chamomile tea. No words for a while, just the comfortable silence between 2 people who had once carried the same weight, now passed gently from one to the other. Finally, Chuck spoke. "You know, when I first bought this place, I thought I was building a restaurant." Melody smiled, waiting. "Turns out, I was building a mirror." Melody tilted her head. He went on. This place didn't just show me what good food or good service looked like. It showed me the parts I needed to soften, the ways I needed to listen, the people I'd overlooked, not on purpose, just out of speed. It made me slow down long enough to see again. Melody's voice was quiet. "And what do you see now?" Chuck's eyes wandered around the room. "I see people who belong. I see presence in motion. I see leadership that doesn't ask for permission. And I see a future that doesn't need me to hold it anymore." She swallowed, emotion rising in her throat, but she didn't let it spill over. Instead, she placed a hand gently on the table between them. "You taught us how." Chuck shook his head gently. "No, I just stopped hiding. That's what gave you permission to lead." They sat together until the dishwashers finished, until the last light in the kitchen flickered off. Then, with no fanfare, Chuck stood, stretched, and pulled his coat from the back of the chair. At the door, he paused, looked back one more time. "Take care of them," he said. Melody nodded. "Always." Then he stepped outside into the soft night air. The wind had picked up, but it wasn't cold. It felt clean, like something was ready to begin. And in that moment, Chuck knew. He hadn't walked away from something. He had walked it forward. The next morning, a new staff member, barely 19, arrived early, first one there, nervous, uncertain, still wondering if she belonged. As she stepped behind the counter, she noticed something pinned to the corkboard just beside the kitchen door. A handwritten note. No name on it, just 5 words. "Your presence is your power." She stared at it for a moment, unsure who wrote it or when. But something about it landed deep, so she took a breath. Ali stood up straighter and began her day. Not perfectly, but fully, because someone, somewhere, had left her a message. And in that small gesture, the story continued. Not with a bang, not with a headline,
but with presence. Quiet, steady, human. The way real leadership always begins and always returns. ChatGPT said, weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of Haven pulsed on like a quiet, steady heartbeat. Regulars kept showing up, some daily, some only when they needed a reminder of something gentle. New faces joined the team, some stayed, some moved on, but no one was left unchanged. People couldn't always explain why Haven felt different. They just knew it did. There was a softness in the way you were greeted at the door, a respect for how the staff listened, a feeling rare and unmistakable that you mattered the moment you walked in. One day, an older gentleman came in around lunchtime, well-dressed, sharp eyes, but carrying something heavy behind them. He sat at a small table near the wall and asked for coffee. Nothing else. For nearly an hour, he sat there, barely touching the cup, staring out the window. Charlie, now one of the senior staff, noticed. He walked over and topped off the coffee without saying a word. Then, quietly, he said, "You don't have to talk, but we're glad you're here." The man blinked, nodded once, and whispered, "My wife used to love this place. She passed last week." Charlie didn't say, "I'm sorry." He just sat with him for a moment, then said softly, "She still does." "You brought her with you?" The man smiled for the first time that day. Not a wide smile, but real. Later, before leaving, he wrote something on a napkin and handed it to Charlie. It read, "Your silence helped me breathe again." Moments like that weren't exceptions at Havens, they were the fabric. And it was no accident. Melody often reminded her team, leadership isn't about how loud you are, it's about how safe people feel when you show up. She didn't need to repeat it often. They lived it every day. And though Chuck was no longer there daily, his presence echoed through it all. He had dropped by now and then, always unannounced, always quiet. He never asked for attention, never walked in like an owner. He just slipped into a seat, ordered something simple, and watched the way things moved. One evening, Melody found him in the back booth, watching a young server handle a difficult guest with calm grace. She slid into the seat across from him, handing him a fresh cup of tea. He looked up, eyes smiling. "You trained her well," he said. Melody shook her head. "No, I just gave her time. The team did the rest." Chuck stirred his tea, thoughtful. "I think it's funny. We used to measure success by numbers. Now I look for moments like that. You know you've built something lasting," he continued, "when people carry your values even when you're not in the room." Melody leaned back and exhaled. "It's not just values," she said. "It's presence. You taught us to bring our whole selves in here, not just our uniforms." Chuck chuckled. "Then you've already gone further than I ever did." They sat like that for a while. There was no need to fill the air. When Chuck finally stood to leave, he paused near the host stand. His fingers brushed across the framed page that still read, "Where Stories Begin." Mm. He tapped the glass gently. Stories never really end, do they? Melody joined him, her voice soft. "Not when they're told from the heart." Chuck looked around one last time, not with the eyes of an owner checking for mistakes, but with the heart of a man who had come full circle. He nodded once, then stepped outside into the night. The wind was cool, the street was quiet, and as he walked, he realized something beautiful. What he had helped build wasn't just a restaurant, it was a place where people rediscovered themselves, where leadership was quiet but real, where presence wasn't a strategy. It's really good when that kept giving long after he was gone. And that, he thought, was more than enough. As seasons changed, Haven remained. Its walls, though slightly worn, seemed to hold every story ever whispered there. Every tear was discreetly wiped in the corner booth, every laugh that echoed late after hours, every moment of silence that didn't need explaining. One crisp autumn morning, a young woman arrived at the front door before opening it. She held a small envelope and stood nervously outside until Melody let her in. She looked around, unsure, then handed the envelope over and said, "This place saved my mom. I just wanted to say thank you." Melody opened the envelope after the girl left. Inside was a photo of Hannah, smiling, standing in front of a small community center with a group of kids. On the back, one sentence was written in careful script. He gave her back her voice. Now she's helping others find theirs. Melody placed the photo in the office, right next to Chuck's old journal still kept on the top shelf. She sat down at the desk and let the moment settle in. It wasn't pride. She felt it was something quieter, something richer, a sense of alignment, of doing what was right even when it wasn't easy. That afternoon, Melody gathered the team for a short meeting. They stood in the soft light of the kitchen, aprons dusted with flour, hands still wet from prep. She held the photo gently and told them Hannah's story again. Most of them hadn't met her, but it didn't matter. They understood what she represented, a legacy not written in headlines, but in healing. After the meeting, one of the newer staff members lingered. He looked barely out of high school, still a bit awkward, still learning. He said quietly, "I didn't think I could belong anywhere before this job." Melody just smiled. "You already do, the moment you walk through the door." That evening, as the sun slipped behind the buildings and cast long golden streaks across the dining room floor, Haven filled with its usual blend of customers, some loud, some quiet, all looking for something simple and human. Maybe a meal, maybe comfort, maybe a place to remember who they were. And Haven gave them that. Not with flash or noise or trends, but with a kind of soul that could only come from the long, patient work of people who cared, people who showed up fully, people who knew that presence was power. And somewhere far from the city, in a small lakeside cabin, Chuck sat on the porch with a notebook in his lap. Like he wasn't writing, just watching the water move, letting the quiet settle around him like an old friend. Sometimes a breeze would carry a scent that reminded him of the kitchen: garlic, butter, or fresh rosemary. Sometimes a memory would surface: Hannah's shaking voice, Charlie's uncertain confidence, Melody's eyes, the first time she truly believed she could lead. And he'd smile, not with nostalgia, but with gratitude, because he didn't need to be there anymore. His work was never about ownership. It was about creating a space where others could rise, where voices could return, where dignity had a seat at the table. As the light faded and stars began to pin themselves in the sky, Chuck closed the notebook and set it beside him. He leaned back, took a deep breath, and whispered into the dark, "We did well. It's not perfect, but good." And sometimes that's the most powerful thing of all: a life lived with intention, a place built with heart, a story told not to impress but to uplift, and passed on quietly, on the one hand to the next. As the stars blinked awake above the lake, Chuck sat in stillness, letting the evening wrap around him like a favorite old coat. He could hear the soft rhythm of crickets in the brush, the gentle rustle of trees swaying in conversation with the wind, and the occasional quiet splash from the water. Life unfolding without urgency. There was a time when silence made him restless, when success had to be loud, movement constant, and presence meant control. But now, silence felt like a trusted friend. It didn't ask anything of him. It just reminded him that things had grown in his absence, and maybe because of it. Inside the cabin, a fire crackled low in the hearth, not for heat, just warmth, the kind of glow that made the room feel lived in. On a shelf above the fireplace, a small wooden frame held a photograph. Not of Chuck during his action star days, not a magazine cover or a crowd. It was a candid photo. Chuck and Melody are behind the kitchen counter at Haven, both laughing, with flour on their hands, surrounded by scribbled notes and coffee mugs, caught in a moment of real life, unscripted, honest. Chuck always thought that was the only legacy worth keeping. Later that night, he wrote a letter. No particular reason, just a habit now. Not to send, just to write, to remember. He wrote about the early days of Haven, the struggles, the pride, the night he heard Hannah crying and knew his life had split into two parts: before that moment and everything after. He wrote about Melody stepping into her voice, about Charlie finding confidence in the quiet corners of service.
About the young man who thought he didn't belong and now trains new hires with gentleness and humor. He ended the letter with a single line: "I used to think power came from being unbreakable. Now I know it comes from being deeply human." He folded the page and slid it into a box where dozens of other letters lived. None of them addressed. None of them needed to be. He slept soundly that night, dreamless, but rested. Miles away, Haven carried on. Another day, another 100 conversations, shared glances, small kindnesses. Another shift of quiet heroes doing work that few noticed but many felt. One evening, as the team closed up, a new server found herself alone in the dining room. She paused at the host stand, reading the framed page. Still untouched, still carrying those 5 words. "Where stories begin." She ran her finger just under the words, then looked around. The room was empty. The chairs were tucked in, lights dimmed. Yet somehow the space still felt full. She smiled to herself, locked the door, turned off the lights, and stepped outside into the night, carrying something with her. Not just memories or tips, but a deeper sense of self, that she mattered, that she belonged, that in some small way her presence helped someone else find their footing, even if only for a moment. And that quiet, lasting, human was the story Haven always told. Long after Chuck had stepped away, long after the last photo faded, long after the words were spoken, still echoing in every kind act, every steady hand, every choice to see someone fully and stay. The story didn't end. It never does. Not when it's written with heart. Years drifted by like the leaves on the lake behind Chuck's cabin. He aged, as all people do, but gently, like someone who had made peace with time. His hands grew slower, but steadier. His voice softened, but it carried more weight. He no longer walked into rooms to be noticed, yet, somehow, when he entered, people leaned in a little closer. Back in the city, Haven had become more than just a place to eat. It had quietly become a place of transformation, the kind people recommended not for the menu, but for the way it made them feel. You didn't just come for a meal, you came to remember what mattered. One afternoon, a documentary crew approached Melody. They wanted to film a segment on the most meaningful small businesses in the region. She hesitated at first. Attention had never been the point, but eventually she agreed, as long as the story stayed honest. During the interview, they asked her a question that caught her off guard. What made Haven different? She paused, looked around at the quiet hum of the room. Then she answered, "They don't teach people how to serve. We teach them how to see." She told them about Chuck, not the movie star, the man who once walked into his own restaurant unnoticed and let it change him. The man who listened more than he spoke, who gave away power instead of hoarding it. The man who never asked for applause, only accountability. The segment aired a few months later. Short, simple, quiet. Just like Haven. And something surprising happened. People from around the country, some even from overseas, began to write letters. Not to apply for jobs, not to make reservations, but just to say thank you. One woman wrote, "My son is a server and he sent me your video. I've never heard him talk about his job with pride before. Now he says he feels like he's part of something." A retired teacher wrote, "I've never stepped foot in your restaurant, but I think I've been looking for a place like it all my life." And perhaps most touching, a small envelope with shaky handwriting arrived at Melody's desk. Inside was a card that simply read, "I walked in lonely, I walked out whole, thank you." No signature. Didn't need one. One snowy morning, Melody drove up to Chuck's cabin with a box full of those letters. He wasn't expecting her. She knocked, and when he opened the door, she just handed him the box and said, "You should see what you've built." He set the box on the table, poured 2 cups of tea, and they sat by the fire reading them, one by one. At first, they chuckled. Then they grew quiet. By the time they reached the last letter, neither of them said a word for a long time. Finally, Chuck looked up. "Funny," he said, "I thought I'd left something behind. Turns out I passed something forward." Melody nodded. "That's the best kind of legacy." He picked up one of the letters again and traced his thumb over the words. "It's not the things we fix that matter most," he said. "It's the people we choose to stand beside while they find the strength to fix themselves." He looked out the window. Snow falling slowly, like time itself was catching its breath. And then he said something he hadn't said in years. "I think I'm ready to come back. Not to run things, just to be part of the room again." Melody smiled. "There will always be a seat for you." And so, on a quiet spring morning, Chuck walked back into Haven, not as an owner or a legend or a symbol, just as a man who still believed in showing up. He took a seat at the bar, ordered his usual soup and tea, watched the team move like a symphony of small kindnesses. No one stared. No one gasped. They just nodded gently, because by then Haven didn't need to name its roots. It left them, and every person who passed through, whether staff or stranger, carried that energy into the world. A kind of leadership that didn't look like command. A kind of presence that didn't demand attention. Just the steady, human power of people who dared to care. And as Chuck watched a new hostess comfort a nervous guest, he whispered under his breath the words that had long ago become the quiet anthem of this place. "Your presence is your power." Then he smiled and simply stayed.